They used to call Africa backward, aid-dependent, a delusional dreamer. For decades, African skies were dominated by imported aircraft, from Boeing Airbus or countries that once ruled the continent. Every time a plane landed in Lagos, Nairobi, or Accra, it wasn't just a flight. It was a bitter reminder, we still control you from above. But then on a blazing morning in Ouagadougou, the unthinkable happened. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a prototype display. It was a real aircraft, built entirely in Burkina Faso, pulled from beneath a military tarp, and ready to take off. No aid money, no IMF contracts, no Western engineers, only African minds, African hands, and an unshakable will to never bow again. The engine roared, the crowd held its breath, and then the plane surged forward, lifted off the ground, and took to the skies. In that moment, an unspoken earthquake rippled across the world. In Washington, military analysts called it a direct strike against the global tech order. In Paris, TV networks avoided the topic. On TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, millions of views, comments, and shares. A different Africa had emerged, and the world wasn't ready. This isn't just a plane. It is a declaration, a statement that we no longer fly on borrowed dreams. We build our own wings. That morning, the runway held its breath. The sun scorched the earth. Dust hovered over the reddish dirt on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. No music, no long speeches. Just a military-grade tarp covering a massive metallic shape. Thousands stood in silence, waiting. And then he walked out. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, in olive green uniform, not smiling, not waving, just walking straight toward the aircraft. Soldiers lined up with precision. Engineers and mechanics stood as they were, grease-stained overalls still clinging to their shoulders. Traoré said nothing. He simply raised his hand, a sharp gesture. The tarp flew off. Silence. Then an eruption. Screams, cries, thunderous applause crashing like a wave. Under the African sun, the aircraft gleamed, painted in red, green, and gold with Burkina Faso's emblem boldly marked on its wings. Not second-hand junk from Paris, not aid from Washington. This was the first airplane ever built by Burkinabe hands. No one believed until it was revealed. No one dared to dream until it took flight. People fell to their knees. Veterans stood tall, tears flowing. Children climbed onto their parents' shoulders shouting, "We can fly now." The aircraft rolled forward. No speeches, no drums. Just the sound of the engine, powerful, steady, like the heartbeat of Africa cast in metal. And then it flew. A smooth, flawless liftoff. No glitches, no deviation. In the clear blue sky, Burkina Faso's aircraft cut through the wind like a declaration, we have written our own history. That aircraft didn't appear out of thin air. It was the result of a silent revolution. No flashbulbs, no press releases, no Western sponsors. Everything began with a bold decision by President Ibrahim Traoré to build a domestic aircraft, no loans, no permissions, no leaks. An almost impossible mission, unless you're patient, discreet, and united by a shared enemy, global condescension. A restricted zone was set up outside Ouagadougou, surrounded by electronic fencing guards and signal jammers. Inside, a group of young Burkinabe engineers, many trained in Moscow and Beijing, began sketching the impossible. No internet, no Google, just paper blueprints, offline computers, and CNC machines running non-stop. Every component was tracked, hidden in unmarked crates, routed through 4 countries to avoid detection. Where did the money come from? Not the World Bank, not the European Union. It came from Burkina Faso's own resources, gold, manganese, and profits once stolen by corrupt intermediaries. Traoré cut off those pipelines and funneled it all into a classified fund. No contracts, no strings, just one goal: we will fly, even if the whole world doubts us. And it wasn't just Burkinabe talent. North Korean metallurgists, Iranian aerospace engineers, Russian stealth advisors, all hand-picked and quietly brought in through untraceable routes. They worked at night. The first engine was tested in a sealed underground chamber. Its roar echoed through the dark like a call from the future. No one on the outside knew what was happening, and that was the point. Every step was a quiet victory, from sketch to structure, from metal to wings, from bolts to engine. Every knock of the hammer, every circuit wired, every line of code was a fierce rejection of the phrase, "Africa can't." And when it was finally complete, Ibrahim Traoré gave just one order: don't announce it, don't promote it, let the world find out when we're already in the sky. When the aircraft lifted off from the Ouagadougou runway, it wasn't just a moment of pride, it was a global strategic shock. At Boeing headquarters in the U.S., internal memos warned of an emerging African tech threat that could disrupt future market share. Airbus in Toulouse held an emergency closed-door meeting. Washington launched a full investigation into the aircraft's technology origins, and the results were stunning. No NATO fingerprints, no EU components, no dependency on Western supply chains. France went silent. French media cautiously labeled the event symbolic, but leaked defense reports revealed the truth. This is a geopolitical rupture. US, French, and British intelligence agencies ramped up satellite activity over Burkina Faso. Strange metal shipments, military-grade electronics, and AI navigation tools traced back to Central Asia. But it was too late. The aircraft was already built, already flying, and they had been completely caught off guard. In fact, they already knew something was happening before the unveiling. A few European businessmen appeared in Burkina Faso, offering partnerships, making pitches, then disappeared. Cyber attacks targeted Burkina Faso's aviation servers non-stop. 2 French nationals were arrested near the test facility, carrying surveillance drones and encrypted drives. But all efforts failed. Because Traoré didn't just build a plane, he built a wall of loyalty, silence, and impenetrability around it. The panic stemmed from one terrifying truth. If a small sanctioned country without Western aid could do this, who might be next? Mali, Niger, Guinea, South Africa is a non-NATO, non-IMF, post-dollar tech alliance quietly emerging. The West isn't afraid of the plane's altitude. They fear what it carries, the collapse of a global order they've ruled for too long. The takeoff of Burkina Faso's aircraft wasn't just a technical victory. It was a political, cultural, and ideological declaration forged in metal and fire. For the first time, an African nation under sanctions, diplomatically isolated without aid from international financial institutions, developed, completed, and launched a modern aviation technology entirely on its own. This event strikes at the core of the dependency mindset that has been implanted in Africa for over a century. Africa can't. Africa needs aid. Africa has resources but no brains. And today, as the plane thundered over the skies of Ouagadougou, an entire generation of young Africans realized they no longer need permission to dream big. The plane didn't just fly. It carried the hopes of a continent. From Ghana to Kenya, from South Africa to Mali, people took to the streets, raised fists, waved flags, and called Traoré a guide for a new African uprising. At African universities, engineering students saw, for the first time, a world-class project not born in Harvard or MIT, but from the soil of their homeland. Many who once planned to migrate to Europe are now applying to return. The old mindset of talent must leave is giving way to a belief we can build right here. This is a revolution of consciousness, not born of bullets or protests, but from a single truth: we are not as small as they once told us. In a world where every piece of tech requires components, licenses, and supply chains from the G7, the rise of a non-aligned aircraft is an unforgivable breach in the global order. Because if Burkina Faso can build this, then Niger can manufacture engines, Chad can supply rare minerals, Guinea can fund it with gold. Suddenly, the global value chain, crafted to centralize power in the West, begins to fracture. The aircraft is not just a symbol of aviation, It's a symbol of economic independence, resource control, and liberation from global capitalist oversight. There's no doubt left this moment doesn't belong to Burkina Faso alone. It belongs to Africa. Dozens of nations have issued official congratulations. Secret meetings are underway to establish a multinational aerospace research institute, engineering scholarship networks, stealth and drone tech testing hubs. A new youth generation is rising, not to flee the continent but to build it. And the most terrifying message to the West: this aircraft is just the beginning. Traoré has confirmed a new model is in development. Larger, longer range, potentially modular, for military payload surveillance systems and, if needed, a defense platform. And most importantly, not a single dollar of IMF debt. No Brussels signatures, no Washington conditions. All of it is funded by Africa's minerals and Africa's mines. The dust hadn't even settled on the runway in Ouagadougou, yet the ripple effects were already crashing into boardrooms, media outlets, and government agencies worldwide. Analysts scrambled to make sense of what they had witnessed. Was this a one-off anomaly, a bold stunt? Or was it something much deeper, an ideological shift in motion? President Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for the applause to fade. He stepped forward not as a soldier this time, not even as a head of state, but as the architect of a vision. His voice was calm, firm, unwavering. We don't just want to fly. We want to build the wings, the engines, and the future. And with that, it became clear this wasn't about a single aircraft. It was a launch pad for a generation. In the days following, the unveiling applications flooded in. Burkinabe engineers living abroad wrote to return home. Students from Mali, Niger, Rwanda, and Ethiopia began campaigning for scholarships to join what was now being called the Pan-African Aerospace Initiative. It was no longer just a project, it was a movement. Young African minds who had once aspired to work for Boeing or Airbus now had a new dream to build under their own flag, not beneath someone else's logo. No longer looking westward, they now looked inward toward the continent, toward their soil, their skies. This is how legacies begin, not with grand speeches, but with tools in hand and purpose in the heart. For too long, Africa was told to emulate Western models, get foreign investment, follow development guidelines, build capacity under supervision. But Traoré's message shattered that formula. Why match what was built to control you when you can build what sets you free? This aircraft was not just a rejection of inferiority, it was an invitation to build differently, with sovereignty, with self-trust, and without compromise. No international loans, no waiting for approvals, no asking permission to dream. Across the continent, a new idea is taking flight. What if Africa didn't have to crawl before walking? What if it skipped the developing label and moved straight into sovereign innovation? Already whispers are growing louder. A joint satellite constellation operated by AES states. A drone defense system to monitor borders without relying on French surveillance. A Pan-African Aerospace University with campuses in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Kigali. This is no longer theory. It's blueprints, test flights, and raw ambition finally given room to soar. To every child in Africa who ever stared at a plane and thought, "That's not for us, this was built for you." To every student without a lab, every engineer without a job, every inventor told their country was too poor, this is your proof. You were never too poor. You were always too powerful to stay small. Don't be fooled by the calm. This is not an isolated event. This is the ignition spark of something far greater. Burkina Faso didn't just challenge the rules they built outside the rulebook. And others are already watching, already learning, already planning. The panic in the West isn't about one aircraft, it's about a model that works without them. A system built not on debt, but on discipline. Not on charity, but on courage. Not on imitation, but on imagination. If this moment moved, you share it. If it gave you hope, speak about it. If it opened your eyes, don't let them close again. Africa's rise doesn't begin when the world accepts it. It begins the moment Africans accept themselves as builders of destiny, not borrowers of progress. Subscribe, follow, join the conversation. This isn't just a channel, it's a platform for sovereignty. The engines are warm, the sky is open, the future is calling. And this time, Africa is flying on its own terms. News of Burkina Faso's historic aircraft launch didn't stop at the runway. It moved like wildfire across borders, through markets, schools, farmlands, and urban hubs. In Nairobi, youth groups gathered spontaneously, waving Pan-African flags and replaying the footage of the plane's liftoff on cracked phone screens. In Dakar, a group of engineering students spray-painted the words, "We build too," across a colonial-era wall. In Harare, schoolchildren rewrote their science fair themes, not around imported robots or Western satellites, but around how to power Africa by Africa. This wasn't a story confined to Burkina Faso. It was a mirror held up to the entire continent, reflecting not what Africa has lacked, but what it has always carried the potential to self-determine. Traoré's decision not to televise the aircraft development process, not to leak the blueprints to gain sympathy or funding, had a hidden power. When the world finally saw the result, it arrived not as a prototype, not as a promise, but as proof. And proof is dangerous to those who profit from doubt. In the following days, millions of African youth took to platforms not to complain or beg for visas, but to ask one bold question: what can we build next? It was no longer about demanding inclusion in a global economy that had excluded them for centuries. It was about redrawing the economic map itself. The narrative shifted overnight. From when will they help us to who else can we count on but ourselves? That change, intangible yet irreversible, was perhaps the greatest outcome of the launch. University deans reported record increases in applications for mechanical engineering, aviation metallurgy, and materials science. Young coders and AI developers, once obsessed with relocating to Silicon Valley, began creating forums for building African-origin software ecosystems. There was a buzz in the air, not of rebellion, but of construction. For centuries, African minerals have left the continent unprocessed, enriching foreign investors, while leaving African populations underdeveloped. But this time, the gold and manganese used in Burkina Faso's project didn't go to Swiss vaults or offshore bank accounts. They went into engines, wings, circuits, and steel. They stayed home. That economic inversion, where raw materials are transformed, not into exports, but into infrastructure signals, something larger than just industrial evolution. It represents a new philosophy that resources are not just to be extracted, but to be directed. And direction, when held by the hands of visionaries, becomes destiny. Though much has been said about the engineers, the materials, and the flight itself, one element remains under-discussed: the network of loyalty that protected the project. For 2 years, hundreds of individuals, technicians, guards, logistics teams remained absolutely silent. In a world addicted to leaks, likes, and live streams, this silence was revolutionary. Traoré didn't just lead a team, he led a mindset. He understood that building outside of the global order required more than money or materials. It required culture, a disciplined, resilient, purpose-driven culture that refused to be bought or broken, and it worked. Intelligence agencies with billion-dollar satellites couldn't stop it. NGOs with partnership offers couldn't infiltrate it. Not because they lacked tools, but because they underestimated the power of people who finally believe in themselves. While many African nations gained political independence in the mid-20th century, the true battle has always been economic and psychological. Traoré's aircraft didn't just cut through airspace, it sliced through a century of mental barriers. For the first time, a generation didn't need colonial validation to know its worth. And that shift could not have come from diplomacy. It didn't arise from an IMF summit or a UN resolution. It took fire, metal dust, and an engine roaring into the blue. That's why the aircraft has become more than an object. It's now a metaphor. When people say we're building wings, they're not just talking about aviation. They're talking about sovereignty, about infrastructure, about education, about art, about every part of life where Africa was once told to wait and is now learning to fly. Of course, the story doesn't end at liftoff. It's only just begun. Already whispers of retaliation are surfacing. Multinational companies are lobbying to restrict exports of machine parts to West Africa. Financial institutions are threatening to blacklist any bank involved with unverified tech. Foreign media have begun subtly inserting doubt into their coverage. Was the aircraft truly safe? Were international standards met? But Traoré anticipated this. He knew that the moment Africa showed it could move without the strings, the puppeteers would panic. That's why he didn't build a plane. He built a framework, a blueprint that cannot be bombed, sanctioned, or censored, because it lives in the minds of millions. Traoré's long-term vision is not bound by one launch. In closed-door sessions with AES leaders, he has already proposed a Pan-African Innovation Pact, a commitment to share not only technology, but methodology, ethics, and resource access across borders. No intellectual property battles, no patents weaponized against the poor, just knowledge free shared, decentralized. A new kind of continental consciousness is forming, one that doesn't aim to replicate the West, but to redefine progress altogether. In this model, success isn't measured by GDP alone, but by how many dreams are made possible without debt, how many communities build with pride, and how many children believe that their future isn't a boarding pass, it's a blueprint. Far from the capital's media glare, the shockwave of the aircraft's liftoff reached even the most remote corners of Burkina Faso. In a dry village near the Niger border, elders gathered beneath a baobab tree, not to gossip or share proverbs, but to listen to a battery-powered radio broadcasting what felt like a myth come true. They said it flew, one whispered. Another nodded slowly and not with French hands. For them, it wasn't about engineering, it was about identity. Goats wandered by children, paused their play, and for the first time in living memory, a national achievement did not require translation. No interpreter, no foreign commentary, just a Burkina voice saying, "We built it. It works." And in that moment, people who had always been told they were too rural, too late, or too poor, felt themselves suddenly aligned with something massive, invisible, and sacred self-worth. In university halls across Africa, the event triggered a storm of debates. Not just about aviation technology or geopolitics, but about the very model of development that had dominated African thought for decades. Students in Addis Ababa, Dakar, and Lusaka began to question aloud what their professors had quietly pondered for years. Had Africa been tricked into aiming low? Seminars shifted focus. Entire courses were redesigned within days. Where syllabi once praised foreign aid structures and structural adjustment programs, young academics began asking, why do we praise policies that produce nothing we own? Books like Confessions of an Economic Hitman found renewed popularity, and Traoré's name began appearing in thesis titles, alongside Fanon Sankara and Nkrumah. In a lecture hall at Makerere University, one female student stood up after watching the aircraft's video and declared, "They told us Africa needed gradual reform. But this is rupture, and we are ready." With Burkina Faso's symbolic leap, Africa's diplomatic vocabulary also began to evolve. At international summits, African delegates no longer arrived seeking inclusion. They arrived with offers. Technical partnerships, research collaborations, resource leverage. In Geneva, one Western diplomat reportedly left a closed-door meeting, muttering they didn't come to negotiate debt relief. They came to talk patents. For decades, African diplomacy had often been shaped by a desperate calculus, how to secure concessions without punishment. But now, a subtle inversion was taking place. With its own aerospace technology in hand, even if modest Burkina Faso had changed the equation, the question was no longer, what will the West give us, but what are we willing to give away? In London, Paris, Atlanta, and Toronto, the African diaspora watched the footage on loop. Many cried. Some stared in disbelief. Others simply fell silent, overcome by something they hadn't felt in years: relevance. Emails and WhatsApp messages flooded consulates. How do I contribute? Can I return? Will my Russian degree be accepted in Ouagadougou? For those long resigned to serving in foreign labs or driving taxis beneath indifferent skies, the aircraft's flight represented more than inspiration. It was an invitation. Traoré had not just ignited nationalism, he had relit the global African connection. A connection that had been fractured by slavery, colonization, and forced migration. Now that diaspora was no longer peripheral, it was essential. Social media giants scrambled. Algorithms designed to elevate celebrity gossip or Western news were overwhelmed by organic virality. The video of the aircraft liftoff was reposted with captions like, "Africa rises, no more aid," and "Burkina leads the way." It broke out of the African echo chamber and into mainstream timelines. Unprompted, unfiltered, unstoppable. TikTok influencers, who usually dance to imported pop songs, now lip-sync to Captain Traoré's rare but powerful quotes. Twitter threads dissected the aircraft's spec supply chain secrecy and implications for BRICS alignment. Instagram artists painted murals of a steel bird soaring from red soil. The system didn't know how to respond. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a war. It wasn't even entertainment. It was truth dressed in humility and flying on sovereignty. At churches and mosques, prayers changed tone. Bless our leaders became bless those who dare build. In one small chapel outside Bamako, the priest closed his sermon not with a verse from scripture, but with Traoré's words, "We don't want permission to fly, we build the wings." For the first time, national pride wasn't a campaign slogan, it was a lived sermon. Clerics and imams across West Africa cited the event, not only as a political feat, but as divine affirmation that Africa's time was not in some distant tomorrow. It was arriving unannounced and already airborne. One of the most overlooked elements in the entire initiative was the quiet but crucial role of women. From metallurgy labs to logistics coordination, from procurement networks to data encryption, Burkinabe women were central to the operation. And though none gave public interviews by design, they became legends overnight. Young girls across the Sahel no longer dreamt of escaping their village. They dreamt of welding wings, writing code, leading control rooms. A new kind of heroine had emerged, not in heels or headlines, but in goggles and grease-stained gloves. This was no echo of Western aviation, no imitation of Cold War race-to-space narratives. It was something entirely original. The aircraft's journey began not in competition, but in defiance. Not to defeat anyone, but to erase the idea that Africa must always come last. In that sense, what Traoré and his team created wasn't merely an aircraft, it was an artifact of African originality, a new genre of leadership invention and collective strength. Even as the dust has now settled on the red dirt of Ouagadougou, nothing beneath it remains the same. A buried confidence has been unearthed. A new psychological infrastructure is forming, one blueprint, one turbine, one belief at a time. And now, when a child in Africa looks up and sees a plane, they no longer have to wonder whose sky it is, because this time the sky answered back. When the aircraft left the Ouagadougou runway, it didn't just rise, it redefined the battlefield. For years, African nations had been forced to outsource their air defense, rely on outdated imports, or function under the shadows of foreign air superiority. But this was different. For the first time, a sovereign African state had built not just a plane, but a possibility, an independent defense capability, born without permission, without licensing, and without compromise. The West's panic wasn't theoretical, it was tactical. Military analysts at NATO headquarters issued internal warnings within hours. If replication spreads across non-aligned states, global strategic asymmetry will be compromised. Translation: they feared not the plane's speed, but its symbolism. If Burkina Faso could build this, it meant other nations might begin protecting their skies on their own terms, without buying overpriced parts or accepting surveillance partnerships. And what happens when African airspace no longer needs guardians in Washington, Paris, or London? It collapses one of the oldest myths of empire, that security must come from outside. Immediately following the aircraft's unveiling, the global information machine shifted into motion. News outlets quietly framed the achievement as symbolic or untested. Defense blogs raised questions about safety and certification. Tech magazines published long essays, wondering whether Burkina Faso had really built it alone. They weren't just curious, they were scared. Because if they admitted it was real, they would also have to admit that decades of development policy, billions in foreign aid, and entire institutions built around African assistance had failed to deliver what a focused nation did in secret. The attack wasn't on the wings or the engine, it was on the story, because stories shape funding, trust, and direction, and whoever controls the narrative controls what comes next. But for once, Africa had already won the narrative, not with press releases, but with proof. In military bases across the Sahel, something extraordinary happened. Soldiers who had been trained on Soviet helicopters or patched up aging American Humvees stood a little taller. It wasn't just about national pride, it was personal. Many of them had family in the engineering corps. Brothers who wired circuits, cousins who transported parts in silence, wives who coded AI for navigation. This wasn't someone else's mission, it was theirs. One sergeant in northern Mali told his commander, "I've carried French weapons for years, but this plane, that feels like carrying my father's name." Across AES states, military academies revised their recruitment language. No longer was national service about protecting borders. It was about building legacies. Young cadets now dreamt not only of medals, but of motors. They wanted to guard the laboratories as much as the front lines. To them, defense was no longer just firepower, it was innovation. Underground labs and unwritten blueprints. Unknown to many, Traoré's aerospace victory was only the visible tip of a much deeper system, one still evolving. Beneath hillsides and in old mining tunnels underground, labs had been repurposed into innovation bunkers. Without a need for PR or public fanfare, these labs focused on stealth drone frames, AI autopilots, and carbon fiber research using indigenous materials. None of it could be traced. No grants, no logos, no donor influence. Just chalkboards, soldering irons, and minds no longer shaped by inferiority. Blueprints were drawn by hand. 3D models were rendered on disconnected networks. Prototypes were tested in valleys where radar couldn't reach. Every breakthrough remained unspoken until it was unignorable. And that's how Traoré liked it. What Burkina Faso proved wasn't just about machinery, it was about meaning. When African nations built nothing, the world called them poor. When they tried to build under supervision, they were called developing. But now that they built without approval, they were called dangerous. So what changed? Only the direction of power. And in that shift, a new philosophy began to emerge. One that rejected the idea that dignity must wait. One that refused to equate patience with progress. A belief not rooted in revenge, but in reconstruction. Building, Traoré often says, privately is the highest form of resistance, because it refuses to destroy even when surrounded by destruction. Global reaction between denial and imitation. While Western governments issued cautious statements, other parts of the world responded differently. Indonesia sent a discreet delegation to Ouagadougou. Venezuela requested a bilateral technology briefing. And whispers from within BRICS Plus circles suggested that the Burkina Faso model could be adapted into a cooperative tech protocol where members pool raw materials, engineers, and research sites to create shared defense and aerospace capabilities outside the Western trade architecture. This was no longer just an African moment. It was becoming a global mirror, forcing emerging nations to ask themselves, why not us? The inner war between cynicism and vision, still not everyone celebrated. Within Africa, some elites scoffed. It's a stunt, said a former finance minister in Abidjan. Sustainability is the real issue. But behind that cynicism was something deeper fear. Because if the model works, the old gatekeepers, the ones fluent in donor jargon and dependent on diplomatic handshakes, would become obsolete. And power rarely surrenders quietly. But the people weren't waiting. From Douala to Dar es Salaam, ordinary Africans began organizing local tech clubs, launching underground maker labs, and offering free tutoring to the next generation of engineers. They didn't care about approval. They cared about momentum. Perhaps the most enduring impact of Burkina Faso's aircraft wasn't even in the sky. It was in the eyes of the children who watched it rise. In those seconds of liftoff, entire assumptions dissolved. No longer was flight something that happened to them, but from them. Teachers rewrote lessons, parents reimagined futures, and in one small village, a 12-year-old boy drew a picture of a plane on the back of a notebook. Beneath it, he wrote one word: ours. Traoré has remained publicly quiet since the launch, but those close to him speak of an unshakable calm. He knows the hardest part isn't building the first aircraft. It's what comes after, scaling without sabotage, growing without greed, defending without repeating the same hierarchies that once colonized the continent. But he also knows something else. The sky is no longer the limit. It's the beginning.